Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this lunch briefing with Professor Elisabeth Prügl on what is gender and diversity today. My name is Diego Gutierrez. I'm the head of the Student Services, and it is my pleasure to help moderate the session today. So what is gender and diversity today? We live in a moment when discussions on gender and diversity are embedded in a multiplicity of concepts, of struggles, of demands, of acronyms, very complex acronyms, theories, hashtags. So in order to shed light on this, we're organizing this lunch briefing with Professor Elisabeth Prügl, who will be addressing the understandings that hide behind, the understandings of gender that hide behind the feminist demands. She will also address the assumptions that are embedded in the struggles for, that we are all very familiar with, gender parity, gender equality, equity of pay, ending sexual harassment, LGBTIQ rights, or intersectionality. So she will be addressing that and at the same time discussing various strands of feminism, and she will assess how they are significant or not to contemporary politics. And we will address in the end, with all this background, the question that is indeed posed to us: what is gender and diversity today? So let me briefly introduce Professor Prügl to you. She's a professor in the International Relations and Political Science Department at the Graduate Institute, and she's the director of the Gender Center. She joined the institute in 2009, and she was the deputy director from 2010 to 2014. Throughout her academic career, both in Switzerland and in the United States, she's been addressing issues both in terms of research and teaching, such as gender politics and international governance and international political economy. She has published extensively on a variety of issues that include atypical forms of women's labor and the international regulation, the neoliberalization of feminism, and gender expertise in international governance. She's also the director of two research consortia on two issues: gender and land grabs and gender and peace building, including partners in countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, Cambodia, or Indonesia. She's also serving on the editorial board of leading international journals such as the International Studies Quarterly, the Review of International Political Economy, the International Feminist Journal of Politics, or the European Journal of Politics and Gender. And early this year, in March 2019, she received the Eminent Scholar Award of the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies section of the International the Studies Association. So before giving the floor to Elisabeth Prügl today, I just wanted to explain the format of the lunch briefing. Professor Prügl will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and comments. And the aim is to finish by 1:30. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Prügl. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Diego, for this introduction. I would also like to thank Sophie Fleury and the team in communications for organizing these lunch briefings. They do this in a very professional way, and they're also very convincing to convince you to actually do it. So thanks, Sophie, for pushing us. What is gender and diversity today? We have at the Graduate Institute this year pronounced the academic year to be under the theme of respect. We want to focus on the way in which we can live together better. And when I say we, I'm talking about a new commission that we have created at the Graduate Institute that is in charge of issues pertaining to gender and diversity. So the Gender and Diversity Commission is taking the opportunity of this year to have a public conversation happening around issues of difference, diversity, of how to deal with difference and how to learn how to better live together. This talk is part of this agenda. And what I want to do today is that I want to put issues pertaining to gender equality, diversity, and related axis of differentiation into a theoretical perspective. Why? Gender and diversity obviously are highly contested issues today. They're very personal, they affect everybody. Typically I find everybody has an opinion on these matters, whatever they may be. They're controversial today, and there's actually an enormous amount of backlash against discourses of equality, so they're contested. We're encountering movements that are suggesting that feminism is destroying the family, that gender is an ideology that needs to be combated and that is dangerous. So we have de facto today a discussion happening that is international, that pits those who think of gender equality as a basic human right against those who think of gender equality as something that destroys basic human values. And as an academic, I believe that these discussions become more sophisticated the more we embed them in research, the more we embed them in understandings that we have gained in gender studies about the issues that lie behind some of the contestations that are going on. So I have a PowerPoint, so what do? I press somewhere. Next is always good. Okay, good. This is the rough outline of my presentation. There are too many points, and so I'm going to go very, very fast. But just to point out two things. First, I'm going to structure the presentation along different theoretical inroads that feminists have made to the issue: liberalism, radical feminism, socialist feminism, constructivism, queer theory, and then we'll talk about diversity and intersectionality. The point to point out here is that the first three topics are specifically starting from a feminist perspective, and I'm moving, in a sense, towards a larger body of writing that is out there. I have a methodology as I go through this talk. Specifically, I'm going to ask myself about all these theories. As I'm engaging with all these theories, I'm going to ask myself, what's the problem made out to be? If gender and diversity is a problem, what does that theory tell us what the problem is that we should be worrying about? Implicit in any problem definition is always a solution. So there's also, the theories provide us with a suggestion as to what needs to be done. And then I'm going to critically interrogate these theories based on their assumptions and try to outline what is implicit in these problem definitions and solutions proposed. Let me start with the first example, familiar to many of you. The Geneva Gender Champions was a major initiative, and I think I saw the head somewhere here, right? Whatever. It was a major initiative that started a few years ago, and the main commitment that the Geneva Gender Champions made is to counteract panels that were exclusively male. So the initiative invited heads of various organizations to pledge that they would not be serving on panels that are exclusively male any longer. And if you go around Geneva today, I think this initiative has had a major impact. You will find very few panels that are exclusively male, and if they are, there's always that risk of being shamed, which is exactly what should be happening here. And this quote is from an annual report that the initiative put out. 2 times more men than women are speaking about security, international law, science, technology, or IT telecom. So there's also a collection of data that is happening about who is speaking. why should we bother? Right? Why should that be a key issue? The assumption here is that that having that if there is no parity in political and public arenas, that this in some way is detrimental to gender equality in itself. That seems entirely intuitive to all of us, because we're all at the basis liberal souls that believe in equality, and equality is to begin with equality of representation, of it's an equality of presence, of actually being there. The problem here is seen to be women's inclusion, and so the kind of policies and solutions that are being proposed is you need to include women into parliaments, you need to get voting rights, you need to include them in all kinds of political arenas. How do you do this? You have supportive mechanisms of all kinds, initiatives of this sort. You educate women and so on. What are the assumptions behind this? As you may have noticed, I haven't used the word gender yet. Liberal approaches start from the presumption that gender basically means women, very often, and that women basically are the same as men. Whether there's an underlying sameness, so if we just strip all the exteriors away, we're all individual human beings, born free, and therefore we should have a right to participate in the polity equally. There's also behind this, and this is the pernicious part of it, sometimes an understanding that that the men are the norm, and that women just don't quite are there yet. They don't have the same kind of leadership style, the same kind of drive, they are self-conscious, they don't have the same aspirations and so on. And so therefore there has to be all kinds of training in order to bring women up to that level of men. As an aside, liberal arguments also exist with regard to race, with the same kind of argument. Underneath it all, we are all the same. Just strip off color, and we are all the same, and we don't have to worry about difference in any way. There's also often an assumption or an imagination of the women that need to be brought up as being implicitly white. Women are always kind of imagined as white, and then black people are always imagined as men. We rarely think about black women in this, right? So there's just this individualism behind liberalism, which has been criticized extensively, and that is not to say that one necessarily needs to oppose the demand for gender parity on panels or in parliaments or whatever as a result of this. So that's example one, and I forgot to click, right? This was about liberalism. Let's move on. Second example, Me Too. I don't need to explain what this is about. The issue of sexual harassment is pervasive in the public arena today. At the Graduate Institute, we have created a mechanism actually to intervene in this, Antenne Harcèlement, which is a network of people we have around the Institute that can be approached. And if some of you are more interested in this, you can find more information on the student website about the Antenne. What's the problem made out to be here? Right? It's not women's, it's not a matter of, we can't talk about parity here. The problem here is male violence. Male violence resulting from, there's different kinds of theories about this. Broadly speaking, I'm just being old-fashioned now, let's call it patriarchy. The fact, reality of women's subordination, women's oppression, women's exploitation, those are all words that fly around there. And behind it, maybe, as some theorists have suggested, patriarchy provides men access to and control over women's bodies. This is what this is really about. What's the solution? The solution can only be radical from this theoretical perspective, right? It requires a liberation, a fundamental change in beliefs, a valuing of the feminine, of going, forgetting about men, going towards a lesbianism, exclude yourself, separate societies. So all these ideas, they're quite old, but they have been formulated and they have been around. What's the assumption here? What does gender mean here? Gender here is really about difference. It's still women, right? But these women who are oppressed and who can only get out of that oppression are fundamentally different from men. They have different values, different qualities, and so therefore you need to establish a separate society. Ultimately, very, very different from what liberals are talking about. So, radical feminism. Example 3. Wage inequality. And this, you may remember the women's strike not too long ago, in June of this year. The main purpose, main objective of the strike was to focus on equal wages, which is the big topic, I think, in Swiss feminist politics today. Equal pay. Women today earn 88% of what men earn in Switzerland for work of equal value. There's serious problems with regard to retirement. Women who disproportionately work part-time don't pay as much into the retirement system, which is all based on the full-time worker. And so as a result, there's a lot of female poverty in old age. There's also, in terms of economic issues, women pay a lot more for services of all kinds. You may have heard about the pink tax. For example, if you buy a shaver, if it's pink, it costs about twice as much than if it's blue. My favorite example is always haircuts. You know, with this haircut, I mean, I have to pay twice as any man. Don't tell me what the difference is. I can't figure it out. It goes relatively fast. So there is an economic issue of inequality baked into the economy. So what's the problem here? Here we're not, women are included in the economy. They're just included unequally, so inclusion is not the issue. It's not about difference, but the suggestion here is, and that mostly comes out of socialist feminist ideas, the problem is the gender division of labor. And you've all heard that term, often refers to the division of productive and reproductive labor, but there's also that gender division or segregation in the labor market that kind of mimics the gender division of labor between productive and reproductive labor. And the result of this is that there is a gender relation that is generated. I'm now talking about gender. I'm not talking about women anymore. There is something structurally in the economy that builds a subordinate and a relationship of subordination between what women do and what men do, what's considered to be female labor and what's considered to be male labor. As a result, we also have huge wage differences between feminized jobs and masculinized jobs, and that's not static, by the way. Well, first of all, one of my favorite examples is always a zookeeper makes more money than a child care teacher or child care provider, right? There are slightly different tasks, but if anything, I would say that child care is a little more complex than feeding animals. Or conversely, a really interesting example also is medical doctors. Medical doctors are highly paid and highly respected in Western Europe. In the former Soviet Union, that was primarily a women's job, and it still is in Russia, as much as I understand. And it's considered to be a very lowly occupation, having very low pay. So it's not the women that are the problem, which is what a liberal would say, but the problem is actually the gendering of jobs, and that gendering of jobs is not static. It actually changes over time. So the gender attaches to the job, and the job is valued in relation to male jobs. So female jobs in relation to male jobs, very often figured around that separation as to who does services, who does care work, and who, on the other hand, produces or I don't know, is engaged in trade or the economy or in finance or issues that are not considered to be feminine. So the gender division of labor is the problem. What's the solution? Much more complicated, right? This involves changing structures, changing gender divisions of labor. Why do we have the gender division of labor? It's one of the most intractable phenomena that continues in all kinds of societies, and different theories go down to psychic levels. Here to the organization of families, to the organization of kinship per se as a basic organizing principle of human societies. Crucial to remember here, the understanding is that gender is a relation, that the masculine and the feminine, they need each other, right? But they are also arranged in a hierarchical fashion towards each other. They mutually constitute each other. And they, in terms of the economy, reproduction and production cannot be thought of separately. People increasingly, feminists increasingly are saying in this vein that women engage in the production of life, and that production of life, paid and unpaid, in its various forms, actually precedes production, and we need to revalue the economy accordingly. All right. In my normal life, I try to avoid talking about Trump, but it's very hard not to talk about Trump. Example number 4, leadership, right? Leadership is one of those very, very heavily gendered concepts. It's gendered masculine. We imagine a particular form of masculinity when we think about leaders, so it's not just any male that could qualify for this. Sometimes referred to as hegemonic masculinity, implies a certain forcefulness, somewhat aggressiveness, show of alpha status, competition, and so on. And what you have here is, on the right, Vladimir Putin actually had a few years ago a very self-conscious effort to do a macho vacation. And he had photographers come with him, and there's whole websites of photographs of him shooting and fishing and so on. So really portraying his masculinity, and this was very much an election strategy at the beginning of through an election period that popularized him and conveyed that he was somebody trustworthy, a real leader. And what I would like to point out here is this conflation of a particular form of masculinity with leadership that resonates. On the left here, you have the famous Trump-Macron handshake. This is 2 alpha males really shaking it out. It proves who is more masculine, right? There's the element of competition and showing who is on top, who is the alpha, is I think, very crucial to the way in which leadership is being performed today. Now, how does femininity play in this with leadership? An alpha male masculine leader is in a relation to a subordinate type of femininity, or a type of femininity that props up this masculinity. And Trump here surrounded by these Miss Universes, which is an organization that, incidentally, he owns. Trump Organization owns Miss Universe, is precisely what does that, right? You're surrounded by beautiful women. They all wear skirts. They all look towards him. They're positioned towards him. They prop him up visually, but they're the logical alternate to celebrating the particular masculinity of leadership that's in there. And then we have Angela Merkel, right, who is very clearly a leader, who leads very differently, who wears pants, not skirts, right, who doesn't look up to him. And this is a joke from the internet, right? I mean, they took the picture and then they put bullets there as to what they might have said. But what is she saying? I told you not to hire Nazis, and what did you do, right? It's the motherly image that we can associate with leadership. Mothers are scary. And people follow them, but it's a different way of doing leadership. So we are very much tied into images and symbols of typical types of ways of performing leadership, with maternalism kind of emerging as this alternative way of gaining authority and respect for women. This is difficult, right? Not all women are mothers. We're not mothers most of the time. It's a certain period of our lives, but that it works. If you want to really gain respect, you have to kind of incorporate this way of acting. Now, what I've just been talking about is actually, I call that feminist constructivism, right? It's the idea that we are performing certain roles, that we are performing gender in certain ways, that gender, therefore, there's not just one gender, right? There's the alpha male gender, and there's all kinds of different ways of being men that does not involve performing Trump, right? And similarly with femininity, there's different ways of performing femininity, yet it's clear that the two tend to be arranged in a hierarchical fashion to each other. I think it became very clear from the Miss Universe image. So what's the problem here? The problem is, in a way, our performances, what we're doing in everyday life. Ideas we have in our minds about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and the fact that we're being held accountable by others if we violate those ideals, right? You can't be too masculine as a woman because it, whatever that means, right? Because it generates all kinds of questioning, and vice versa. Heaven forbid, man cannot be a sissy, right? Cannot be feminine. There's a lot of negative stereotyping that goes with that, or negative reactions that go with it. So gender here is not women. It's also not a structure, but it is a script. It's a set of roles that we perform. Example 5. The Vatican, just a few weeks ago, published, the Congregation for Catholic Education published this pamphlet that insists on the complementarity of gender and the procreative end of sexuality. A natural fact, they say, is gender is a natural fact, not a social construct, contradicting what I've just said, that in fact we today have individualism running rampant, and we cannot think of issues of gender and sexuality as a matter of choice. There is a natural order there that needs to be preserved. This is, of course, precisely in reaction to the other 3 images that I have up there. And these 3 images portray quite different phenomena, actually. You have on the top right a questioning of gender identities. So so when are you really going to transition? This is from a website that says the things that you should never ask a trans person, right? It highlights, in my mind, the discomfort we have when we have somebody so blatantly violating the idea that there's men and women and nothing in between, right? And how difficult it is actually to be the person that this young trans person represents. We immediately say, well, is it a man, is it a woman, where are they, what are they doing, right? How long are they going to be like that? Let's fix it so they become either men or women. So it's this impossible situation, this impossible identity, this impossible existence that is being lived out here. And that impossible existence had to do with the fact that we think of gender as purely binary, that there's nothing beyond that binary. Moving down here to this Netflix video, this is less or related to gender identity, but more than anything, we're talking here about two women kissing. This is about sexual orientation, a different matter than gender identity. I think we can conceptually separate that, but again, based on an understanding that a binary gender order has in parallel a certain sexual orientation. Women orient themselves towards men, men orient themselves towards women, and anything else is a violation of that order. I think this lesbian and gay lifestyles have become much more acceptable in society more broadly, more though than trans people. And then on the bottom left, you see a picture of Caster Semenya, who is the South African athlete who has been disqualified from participating in the Olympics because she is not considered to be a woman, or has been. She says she's a woman. The Court of Arbitration has said she's not a woman, given... I'm looking at Lena. She's writing on this, so I have to get it right. It was given on hormones, based on hormones, right? So here we have somebody, and the issue that's in the foreground here is actually sex characteristics, right? She has not defined herself as intersexed, yet she has to defend that she is a woman, right? Others try to assure very, very hard that they can make the separation between women and men, and they cannot place her from the outside. So there's three issues here. There is gender identity, there's sexual orientation, and then there's also sex characteristics that we have traditionally thought of as binary and that are being disturbed. And this is precisely what the Vatican is reacting against. Well, queer theory tells us that there's actually a power relation that is expressed through gender, sexual orientation, and sex characteristics. That thinking about sexual orientation in this binary way is a heteronormative understanding of how the world should be organized, that we often do violence to intersexed bodies. There's a lot of sexual ambiguities get operated on very quickly. So there's a lot of actual and discursive violence that is happening, that is moving people into the binaries. What are the solutions here? The solutions ultimately have to do with getting rid of gender itself, if I can put it that way, right? So gender itself becomes the problem. It's not just a descriptor of what is going on in the world, but it actually is a force that produces violence by virtue of the fact that we think of it as a binary logic that organizes our world and organizes our lives. The assumption here is that gender becomes a force that is inscribed on bodies, and that biology and society are tightly intertwined, that this understanding we have about the binariness of sex and gender actually gets inscribed onto our bodies in various ways, so that it actually materializes binary situations that are ultimately violent. Now, sixth and last example. I'm moving now towards talking about diversity, and starting with this example of diversity management. This is an image of the many images you can find on the internet advertising diversity management consulting, which businesses have taken on, of course, and we now have a gender equality and diversity commission. So this concept of diversity is coming up very, very strongly in all kinds of situations. And it moves the point of consideration beyond gender to include race, to include sexual orientation, to include disability issues, and so on. I mean, they have a whole slew of things that are being addressed here. The problem I see in many of these approaches is that there is a tendency to think of this united color of Benetton's image of organizations as something that is productive, right? It's good for the organization, it creates synergies, it creates new ideas, it makes us better people, and then it becomes commercialized. And I think we see a lot of that happening today, which gives me a certain amount of discomfort, but then on the other hand, like these particular consultants said, diversity is an asset. It begins with diversity and it ends with liberation. Maybe they are right. But I think there's a certain hesitation that we should introduce about the way in which difference is being neoliberalized, I think, or how it is being adopted in neoliberal contexts. There's another term out there. The term is the awkward term intersectionality, which feminist theorists have put forward. And they similarly bring together these different status differentiations or axis of difference or whatever you want to call it. In this instance, foregrounding in particular the way in which these differences incorporate certain power relations. So that specifically if you are of a particular gender identity and a particular sexual orientation, it doesn't mean that you are being doubly disadvantaged, but there's something about the specificity of your experience that is different from anybody else. And what's important here is to remember that that intersectionality does away with monolithic constructions, so we can't actually think of gender or women or gender inequality as a problem that exists independently from other types of inequalities, and that the kind of intersecting identities that people adopt actually affect everyday lives, activism, life experiences, etc. In academia, we have taken this on also with an idea that people know differently, and so it is important to integrate people with different experiences, with different struggles into academic knowledge. to decolonize knowledge. We know that knowledge is produced in the South are often overlaid with colonial knowledges, and to struggle free from these knowledges becomes an important thing to accomplish. What are the solutions? Diversity policies, intersectional laws. Law has become quite interested in this issue. What are the assumptions? The assumption, I think, crucially here is also with queer theory is that difference is productive. It makes things happening. These may be productive things, as we try to imagine within organizations and in academia, right, that it contributes something new. But it may also be power being unleashed on people so that their opportunities are being limited and constrained. So all kinds of different things can emerge from these intersections. Let me close. What is gender and diversity today? I have hopefully moved you along from understanding women, gender as women that are just like men, to understanding women as being fundamentally different from men, to proposing that gender is a structural relationship, to proposing that gender is a social construct, the leadership thing, right? To suggesting that gender is a heteronormative performance, and to end up with a suggestion that we need to think of gender as just one of many intersections of race, nationality, class, ability, sexual orientation, and other things with which it needs to be paired and with which it needs to be sought jointly. So, in this academic year that we have now, dedicated to respect and to learning how to live together, I would suggest that we need to learn a number of things. We need to learn first tolerance, which is a very basic, I think, value of letting difference be, but it's not enough. We actually need to learn to actively understand difference, to embrace difference, to invite difference, to question the difference we ourselves live, the way we are internally multiple forms of difference. And by that I mean not just the obvious ones. And finally, I think we might want to think about whether it might not be worth to undo difference, to undo gender, and to think about how far we want to take that without becoming liberals again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And let's open now the floor for questions and comments. We have about 15 minutes, and if you want to participate, please raise your hand. We have a couple of microphones, so the microphone will come to you. Yeah, so the microphone will come to you, and please state your name and your affiliation so we know who you are. Who wants to open the floor? Yeah, there's a question here.
Hello, thank you for the speech. My name is El Sarapi. I work at the European Broadcasting Union. I work on gender and sport. I wanted to ask you, how do we undo difference?
Yeah, that's conceptually so easy, right? We do difference all the time, every day. One of the things that I tend to do Sunday afternoon walks in the forest around Geneva, and the Genevans are very nice people. So you always get bonjour, monsieur, dame, bonjour, madame, bonjour, monsieur. They're doing difference. They're not undoing difference, right? And so it's simple things like being aware of when we are enforcing or recalling, there's men and there's women, right? This is a very stupid example, I realize that, right? This is not going to change the world if I don't say monsieur, dame anymore. But I think what some younger people and students are actually telling me is to get rid of pronouns, to change the pronouns, to think of ourselves as much more fluid in our gender identities, when we mess with categories in the labor market, I think, and introduce women into male jobs and men into female jobs, right? We're actually participating in undoing gender, I think. Right, and so I think the idea is really to stop putting so much importance into it, to give it so much importance. Lena's other example there, I'm sorry to quote you constantly, in her dissertation she writes about gender registration. The first thing we do to those poor babies is we call them either female or male, and before they even have made their first, cried for the first time. Why is that so important? And the rest of our lives gets organized along the binary, the way we dress, the way we perform, the way we are, what kind of bodies we develop. They're not naturally dressed in skirts and so on, right? So to me it's a performance. It's thinking about performing differently, and I think it's actually happening, right? More or less consciously, because feminist movements have asked precisely that. But I think queer and trans movement are kind of really pushing us the next step there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Victor. I'm from Argentina, and I'm a student at the LLM International Law here. I have two questions. I hope it's okay. The first question is, what do you think is the role of positive affirmative actions in order to change this reality? And my second question is, what do you think is the value of changing language? Maybe in English it's not such a big issue, but for example in Spanish, usually when you refer to the plural, you use masculine words to refer to a group of women and men, or any kind of person. So what do you think is the importance of a change in that kind of language?
I think affirmative action is super important. It has changed a lot in employment relationships, and it is absolutely premature to get rid of affirmative action. At the same time, affirmative action makes visible precisely the discomfort with saying, well, we just need to abolish gender entirely, right? That's our long-term goal. But in order to get there, we need to say, we need affirmative action for X, women, people who are black, people self-identified in various ways, right? So we need the categories in a sense, and that's the contradiction, while we also need to abolish them. And that's a tricky, I think it's an issue of long-term and short-term. Language is, yes, English is easy, right? Because they don't have any gender articles. Whereas, Spanish, German, a lot of other languages also play with gender a lot more extensively still. I don't know what to do in Spanish, right? I don't know Spanish well enough to have an answer to that, but I realize that there's a lot of movements in different language communities to de-gender. Even in French, the French who are notorious for not wanting to change their language are starting to at least starting to include feminine versions of jobs, and those have been now officially accepted as real things.
My name is Bonnie Fazio. I'm the founder of Inspired Women Lead. And I would be very interested to know what you see as these new upcoming leaders, what you have to say about, for instance, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, or even the President of Croatia, who I believe are stepping forward with what I would almost call authentic feminine leadership. And how does that fit into the discourse today? Thank you.
Super interesting. I love these women. I think they're super inspiring. And what is inspiring about them is precisely what you say, is that they put forward a different kind of leadership. So it's not the macho alpha male kind of leadership that are portrayed there. I'm wondering whether we have to call that feminine. It's just normal, right? I don't know, inclusive, a way of being. The problem you run into is when you call it feminine again, that you kind of make it another, something that's different, something that is maybe not normal, when it is normal. So it goes again in with that tension of, on the one hand, we need those women, and they are women, and we understand them as women, and they draw a lot of resources from that, I'm sure. But at the same time, if we keep calling them women leaders, they're not just leaders, and that's what they are. They're like the real leaders.
So how to make that truly normal?
Get more of them. Take over the world.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. So I have two questions. One is more institutional, related to the context of the Graduate Institute, and the other more conceptual, but also related to the Graduate Institute. So the first one is, I would be just interested in knowing whether within this year, where we focus on respect at the Institute, whether the Gender and Diversity Commission has specific goals, has specific targets, because we recently had a meeting in the ADA, which is the representative body of the teaching assistants and research assistants, where we talked about parental leave, so whether this is also kind of on the agenda of the Gender and Diversity Commission. And the second point I wanted to raise is, when I listened to your talk on equal pay and the gender division of labor, the reproductive versus the productive sphere, I was also reminded of the fact that I think in the Institute there's a lot of reproductive work undertaken which is not seen and valued. We have more and more of female professors, but then we don't know who are the one actually supervising or more supervising the students, because this is work which is maybe not so prestigious. It actually takes a lot of effort and a lot of work. Who are the people participating in the committees? Who are the people participating in Anti-Nash, the anti-harassment network, and who are the people participating in the Gender and Diversity Commission. So when we did the Feminist Week, we also argued for a paid position to institutionalize gender and diversity at the Institute. But then in the last point was on diversity management and how this can be, diversity is commercialized and neoliberalized. So my question is, how can we also value reproductive work undertaken at the Institute without necessarily paying for it? How can this become something which we appreciate without maybe necessarily institutionalizing through a paid position? Thanks.
As you know, Lina, the the Commission is a year old now. We started this last year. We do have a work plan, so we have had brainstorming meetings, and we have created it from the bottom up with particular interests also articulated. There's a number of priorities that we have set for this year, one of which is actually data collection. We have a lot of data, I think, on some of the issues that you are mentioning, but they're buried in different systems. So, you know, who sits on committees, maybe we don't have statistics about that, but we certainly have statistics about who supervises students. And so that subgroup in the Commission is actually precisely working on making visible some of these issues. There's a parental leave group also. I'm kind of looking at Sophie at this point because I don't remember them all. But I know there's a group on parental leave that is also organizing. And so I think, you know, this is not going to change everything from one day to the next, but I think there's a kind of a gradual making the issue into issues that is happening. And I think we see that already with communications actually has been very proactive in putting the gender issue on the front page regularly at the Institute. How can we make that without paying? We shouldn't. Right? I mean, we live in a capitalist society, and even though I think there's better ways of organizing, or capitalism shouldn't be ferocious in the way it is, I do think that ultimately, if you don't put money behind it, there's no value attached to it. Whether that then is a capitalist exploitative labor relationship that actually generates profit, I'm not actually sure. I mean, in a sense, we are in a service environment. We're in the education sector. Graduate Institute doesn't make a lot of profit from what it does. It's not allowed to, by definition. So also, I think we also need to think a little bit about what we actually mean by the neoliberalization of diversity. It is an issue. I mean, it is an issue. We'd like to have nice images out there. It helps the PR, it helps the recruitment of students and so on, but are we then actually also liking to integrate those students as much as we like them? We like their faces on our propaganda. That's, I think, a fair enough question.
Yeah, maybe one last question.
Hi, my name is Atif, and I work at the International Labour Organization. I just wanted to follow up with that question, actually, about valuing and paying for some of this, like, unpaid work, for example. Isn't there maybe a risk that, whilst it might be liberating, it might also entrench those gender inequalities and stop us from really undoing the differences that you say that we should maybe be trying to do?
In which way? Can you be more specific?
For instance, I think if we're paying for household work, for example, which is one argument, and then on average there will be mostly women who are getting payment, but would that then perhaps risk women staying in that and continuing the segregation of the labor market? Thanks.
Yeah, that's the old wages for housework debate. You know, de facto, more and more of the work that has actually taken place in household over time has been moving into the public and paid sector. I mean, it started with production work, you know, in the cottage industry, moving into factories, and I think we're progressively moving more and more labor actually outside of households, including care labor. Think about old age homes, think about childcare. A lot of that is actually happening in the paid sector, and and even with care work now, care work being remunerated inside households, care workers going into households being paid. So a lot of the kind of commodification of care labor has already been happening, and it continues to be happening. What's interesting to me is also to think about the conditions of labor of those workers, which are often quite marginal, but also to think a little more hard about what it means to commodify this kinds of labor. And there's different ways in which that can be done. My mother is 90 years old. She has somebody coming in every day in the morning to get her up, to wash her and so on. That woman needs to record. She has prescribed. She can do 7 minutes for washing, 5 minutes for dressing. It's cut down that precisely, and she needs to record when she leaves what she has done and what time it is and so on. So this is a way of commodifying care that is actually horrifying. Right? And the only reason that works actually is because most of these women who are doing this work don't care what the corporates are telling them, but are violating these rules all the time, or putting in more time, or establishing personal relationships that are actually quite deep, and it's amazing. So this is not making widgets. This is a very different kind of labor, and so I think there's also a rethinking of what labor actually is. We're becoming much more a service economy in the North, certainly. So services are taking over, and the kind of the production of the widgets is mostly taken over by the robots. So what does that mean for the way in which we organize labor? Maybe we need a basic universal wage, and and just make sure that caring is just covered as something that we all are doing. So I think it's a super interesting question, but I think it is a question that actually is about the way as to what capitalism is becoming as we are becoming service economies.
Okay, I'm sorry, but time's up. So thank you very much to all of you for coming. Thank you for those that participated, and thank you, Professor.